पर मोहम्मद व आले मोहम्मद सलवात। أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نون والقلم وما يسطرون. ما أنت بنعمة ربك بمجنون. وإن لك لأجرا غير ممنون. وإنك لعلى خلق عظيم. فستبصر ويبصرون بأيكم المفتون. إن ربك هو أعلم بمن ضل عن سبيله وهو أعلم بالمهتدين. فلا تطع المكذبين. ودوا لو تدهنوا فيدهنون. ولا تطع كل حلاف مهين هماز مشاء بنميم مناع للخير معتد أثيم عتل بعد ذلك زنيم أن كان ذا مال وبنين. إذا تتلى عليه آياتنا قال أساطير الأولين. سنسمه على الخرطوم. إنا بلوناهم كما بلونا أصحاب الجنة إذ أقسموا ليصرمنها مصبحين ولا يستثنون. فطاف عليها طائف من ربك وهم نائمون فأصبحت كالصريم. فتنادوا مصبحين أن اغدوا على حرثكم إن كنتم صارمين. فانطلقوا وهم يتخافتون ألا يدخلنها اليوم عليكم مسكين. وغدوا على حرد قادرين. فلما رأوها قالوا إنا لضالون بل نحن محرومون. قال أوسطهم ألم أقل لكم لولا تسبحون. قالوا سبحان ربنا إنا كنا ظالمين. فأقبل بعضهم على بعض يتلاومون. قالوا يا ويلنا إنا كنا طاغين. عسى ربنا أن يبدلنا خيرا منها إنا إلى ربنا راغبون. كذلك العذاب ولعذاب الآخرة أكبر لو كانوا يعلمون. إن للمتقين عند ربهم جنات النعيم. أفنجعل المسلمين كالمجرمين. ما لكم كيف تحكمون. أم لكم كتاب فيه تدرسون. إن لكم فيه لما تخيرون. أم لكم أيمان علينا بالغة إلى يوم القيامة إن لكم لما تحكمون. سلهم أيهم بذلك زعيم أم لهم شركاء فليأتوا بشركائهم إن كانوا صادقين يوم يكشف عن ساق ويدعون إلى السجود فلا يستطيعون خاشعة أبصارهم ترهقهم ذلة وقد كانوا يدعون إلى السجود وهم سالمون فذرني ومن يكذب بهذا الحديث سنستدرجهم من حيث لا يعلمون وأملي لهم إن كيدي متين أم تسألهم أجرا فهم من مغرم مثقلون أم عندهم الغيب فهم يكتبون فاصبر لحكم ربك ولا تكن كصاحب الحوت إذ نادى وهو مكظوم لولا أن تداركه نعمة من ربه لنبذ بالعراء وهو مذموم فاجتباه ربه فجعله من الصالحين وإن يكاد الذين كفروا ليزلقونك بأبصارهم لما سمعوا الذكر ويقولون إنه لمجنون وما هو إلا ذكر للعالمين صدق الله العلي العظيم. سورة المباركة الفاتحة.
या रब्बी हक ज़हरा तौफीक ये अता हो मरने से पहले या रब दीदारे करबला हो या रब्बी हक ज़हरा तौफीक ये अता हो मरने से पहले या रब रे करबला हो जो अर्ज़ करबला है हर अर्ज़ से सिवा है इसका के करबला में शेका लहू मिला है हर ला दवा मरज़ की ये का कही दवा हो मरने से पहले या रब दीदारे करबला हो या रब हक ज़हरा तौफीक ये अता हो मरने से पहले या रब दीदारे करबला हो मैं भी तुम्हारा तमी हूँ ज़ाकिर हुसैनी سزا کری کہ میری قسمت میں یہ اصلاح ہو، مرنے سے پہلے یا رب دیدار کربلا ہو، یا رب حق زہرا فی کے یہ عطا ہو، مرنے سے پہلے یا رب دیدار کربلا ہو، یا رب نماز شب میں بس یہ دعا کروں میں، کچھ دیر اس زمیں پر مجلس پپا کروں میں، ہر ماتمی کے لب پر ہر دم یہی دعا ہو، مرنے سے پہلے یا رب دیدار کربلا ہو، یا رب حق زہرا توفیق یہ عطا ہو، مرنے سے پہلے یا رب دیدار کربلا ہو، مظلومیت پہ جس کی روتا ہے یہ زمانہ، اس بے قطع کے در پر ایک بار تو ہے جانا، جو قرض ہے لہو پر وہ اس طرح عطا ہو، مرنے سے پہلے یا رب دیدار کربلا ہو، یا رب حق زہرا توفیق یہ عطا ہو، مرنے سے پہلے یا رب دیدار کربلا ہو۔
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Sayyid Hasan, Rizvi, respected elders, dearest brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum, Jameen wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Surah Fatiha is requested for all marhameen listed on the screen, as well as all other marhameen. Surah Mubarakatul Fatiha. Dua Shfa Maries is requested for all those who are in need here and elsewhere, as well as those listed on the screen. Let us recite together. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. أَمَّا يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ 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 أَمَّا يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ. Ya Allah. Let us now invite Sayyid Hasan Rizvi to please come forward for tonight's majlis. By Muhammad wa al Muhammad salawat.
رحم الله من قرأ الفاتحة بعد الصلوات. اللهم صل على آل محمد. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين شفيع المذنبين رحمة للعالمين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا والشفيع نفوسنا والطبيب ذنوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين أما بعد صلوات على محمد وآل محمد مؤمنين مؤمنات brothers and sisters in Islam and Iman Salamun alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight on the 3rd of Rajab we are commemorating the Shahadah of our 10th Holy Imam, Imam Ali ibn Muhammad Al-Hadiyan An-Naqi alayhi salatu wassalam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa During the reign of Muttawaki Al-Abbasi, Mal'un, right, one of the most tyrannical Abbasid leaders, especially during the 6 different Khalifas that our 10th Imam was contemporaneous with. During his reign, as usual, those who were enemies of the Ahlul Bayt, at one point, while the Imam was imprisoned, house arrested basically in Samarra, some individuals came to the court of Muttawakkil and they lodged some complaints about Imam al-Hadi. And they claimed that they knew, they were witness to, and they had information that the Imam was up to no good. And they told Muttawakkil that we know that, obviously they don't refer to him as Imam al-Hadi, but this Ali ibn Muhammad, he has been getting letters of support from his followers. He's been getting weapons and collecting them. He's been getting money. Basically, he's trying to start a revolution. And he's getting ready to take down your Khilafah and to take you out. So Muttawakkil, as soon as he heard this from these individuals, he sent some agents in the middle of the night to the house of Imam al-Hadi. And when they got there, they didn't find anything like that. No money, no letters of support, no weapons, nothing like that. The narrators say that when they got there, they went and the house was pretty much empty, nothing there. They found the Imam by himself in a room all alone. They found him sitting, reciting Quran and in ibadah. Not even sitting on a mat. He was sitting on just the bare ground, just on dirt, on sand. That's it. So just like that, in that state, they didn't find what they were looking for, but still, they took the Imam like this towards Muttawakkil. And they explained, they said, we went, we searched all throughout the house, we couldn't find anything. We found him reciting Quran in ibadah all by himself facing the Qibla. That's what we found. And when Muttawakkil heard this, and again, he had this hatred for the Imam and for all the Ahlul Bayt. But when he heard this story about the Imam, and there was some, I guess that, Nurani sort of feature of the Imam, and the effect of that late night ibadah from the Imam, it had an effect on Muttawakkil. So then he begins, whether it's, it was real or it was a farce, we don't know, but he starts to praise and honor the Imam. He says, oh, son of Zahra, son of Muhammad, and all these things, right? To praise him in all these different ways. He said, come, please, sit next to me. So he calls him and he has him sit next to him on his throne. And he honored him and praised him. But then, because at that point, just like many of the Abbasid Khulafa, he was sitting there drinking wine. So, in this drunken stupor, he took, he had an extra cup of wine. He said, here, why don't you have some too? The Imam replies to him, he says, my blood and flesh have never been mixed with such a thing. So, excuse me, right? He could have been much ruder in his response, but he left it at that. So when Muttawakkil heard this response, he still needed something from the Imam. You know, when a person in power, they don't like having their requests rejected, right? So he makes another request of the Imam, and he asks him to do something. He asks him to perform something. After the Imam performs this and does this, it results in a few different things. After the Imam performs these actions, they say that everybody who was present in the palace, in the court at that time, began wailing and crying. Even Muttawaki himself, they said he was crying so much that his beard was soaked. That's how much he cried. He was soaked with tears. He was regretful for what he had been doing. He said, take all of these drinks, all the alcohol, take the wine, these cups, get it out of here, right? Get rid of it. Then he ordered that 4,000 dirhams be given to the Imam, and then he said, no, please go home. And he sent him with honor and dignity. So our question is, what exactly did the Imam do to result in such an action by this mal'oon, horrible Khalifa, this zalim? What could he have done to make Muttawaki so remorseful, so regretful? You know, you might have some ideas in your mind. Maybe he recited a special dua. Maybe, you know, there's a special ziyarah. I don't know, who knows what it was. That what the Imam performed is actually going to be the subject of our discussion tonight. You know, a lot of our ibadat, our worship, over time, from where we've come from the East in our Islamic countries over here now, we've gone through these huge evolutions and changes in the way that we perform our ibadah. You know, before, back home, when we would recite certain things, perform certain ibadat, we would just do so reciting the Arabic, right? Again, all of us who are coming from non-Arab backgrounds, we would just perform these ibadat, recite everything without any consideration for the meaning. You know, the whole point was just to recite it, get it done, and that's it, right? That was the job. But over time now, especially now over here in the West, we've made it a point to at least have, you know, the English translation there. And some go beyond that and say, look, we need to not just have the translation, we need to have a deeper understanding and a connection. We need to know exactly what's going on behind these different types of ibadat. What's the deeper philosophy, the wisdom, the hikmah, all of these things. So we've made changes in the way that we perform our ibadah. Now, there's two different types, two different categories of ibadat or actions that a Muslim can perform where we've had these evolutions and changes, or where they can be performed. Some of them are the obvious ones that have probably come to your mind, right? One is obviously the Quran. Now, you and I can obviously sit there and recite the Arabic without any translation whatsoever. And yes, just reciting the Arabic by itself has its reward. It's good to do. It has a positive effect on the soul. But of course, there's a different set of results and rewards when you have a translation with you. Or you go to a tafsir, right? And you mix it and enhance it and complement it with the hadith from the Ahlul Bayt, right? So that it takes it up to the next level. Of course, you have salah as well. Most of us are used to just learning it and performing it, and that's it. But especially those of you who have attended the Secrets of Salah workshop, right, a couple months ago, now you've seen that after learning not just the translation, but some of the deep wisdoms and meanings behind these actions, it completely changes the way that you perform your salah, right? Your namaz is at a whole different level now, inshallah. And of course, du'as, ziyarat, all the different a'mal that we perform, we've now gradually changed as communities. Right? It's very rare now where you go to a community and they say, look, no translations, no meaning, just get it done. Hardly any community does that anymore. Most communities will at least have a PowerPoint presentation with a translation. And many will say, look, let's spend 5, 10, 15 minutes getting, an introduction to each part of the a'mal or the dua. For all of us who have gone for ziyarat and who, inshallah, will continue to go, it's something that we almost expect now for a ziyarah group, right? We expect that the spiritual guide who's there has to explain everything that's happening, right? Give us some pointers about ziyarat Ashura. Give us some pointers about what our mindset should be when we go to the qabr and the dharih of this ma'soom, for example, right? So we're expecting that higher level of connection. So all these different types of ibadah, Quran, salat, du'as, a'mal, ziyarat, it's normal now. It's the obvious thing where we want a deeper connection, where we expect to have a higher level of ma'rifah beyond just the Arabic recitation, right? But then there are some things, some actions that a Muslim performs, some ibadat, that are maybe not so obvious, that maybe we could greatly improve upon it if we actually had some ma'rifah and had a goal and a maqsad and a purpose behind how we performed it. So for example, in Islam we have a system of Islamic finance and economics, specifically like a socio-economic plan. So normally, when you and I give sadaqah, we just kind of haphazardly just give it, right? Somebody asks, we put it in a box. Somebody's on the street, we give it to them. Somebody asks, that's it. We don't have this deeper ma'rifah about the Islamic goal behind sadaqah. Or, for example, khums, right? Pay our sahm sadat, sahm imam, we just give it away, ask for the receipt, and we're kind of done. But there's a deeper goal and ma'rifah behind khums as well. Anything that, let's say, when there's funding or donations requested for a certain project, again, sometimes we just give, okay, they're building wells, good, or they're helping the orphans, good. We just give it out. We don't always think that maybe there's a proper Islamic short-term, medium-term, and long-term goal behind all of these things. If we had the ma'rifah, then we would know exactly how and when and who to give to, right? There's something else that our communities, especially our communities, have been very, very negligent of, that sometimes we end up performing without the proper niyyah. We perform without the proper knowledge and without any sense of ma'rifah. And when that happens, this type of action, this type of ibadah ends up possibly destroying communities as a whole. But on the other hand, this same ibadah, if performed with proper niyyah, with knowledge, with ma'rifah, can lead to revolutions and completely transform societies. So what is this thing, and what was it that the Imam actually had performed in front of Muttawaki to get him to completely do a 180? It was this ibadah known as ash-shi'r, poetry. And this will be the subject of our discussion tonight. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So again, poetry is one of the less obvious forms of ibadat. It's not like the Quran. Right? The Quran says that this is not poetry, clearly, in many ayat, right? And it says, reminding people, the Arabs then, that, this prophet is not a poet as well. So don't mix these two ideas. Our du'as, our a'mal and ziyarat, they are not poetry in that sense. Poetry is a completely different type of ibadah. And it was so powerful, the way that the Imam had performed it in front of Muttawaki, that you see that he himself was crying and he had changed his mind. And inshallah, a little bit later on, if we have time, we're going to go through just a simple translation of what the Imam had said in front of Muttawaki. Now, some of us, we know that poetry has an Islamic context to it, right? A lot of times we get into this debate and this argument and discussion about religion and culture. And a lot of people would take poetry and they would throw it in the cultural category and they wouldn't consider it Islamic. And this would be a grave mistake, because we have many different hadith and narrations talking about the benefits of poetry, the encouragement of the Imams towards poets and the way that they honored them and they treated them, right? So for example, just one or two examples just to refresh our memory. This one is from Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. And this example is probably the most famous example, the one that comes to, I guess, the mind of any Shia. He's reported to have said, Man ashadda fil Hussein bayta min shi'r. Whoever recites just one single bayt, one verse of poetry, one line of poetry about Imam Hussein alayhi salam, fabaka, and they cry. Wa abka ashara, and they make even 10 people cry because of the poetry they recited. Falahu walahumul jannah. For that poet and for the ones that he made cry, those 10 individuals, Jannah becomes wajib for them. Right? And we've seen many different narrations like this as well. In history, we know that, when we discuss some of the ashab and the companions of the Ahlul Bayt, normally we think about those who were well-versed in the knowledge of the Ahlul Bayt, right? Like Zurara, right? Or Hisham ibn Hakam. They would go and they would debate the Khawarij and the Awam and the enemies of the Ahlul Bayt. So we think about knowledge, right? Okay. Or we think about those who joined Imam Hussein on the battlefield. So we think about the true ashab in terms of knowledge or in terms of their jihad on the battlefield. It's not often that when we think of a proper sahaba, a companion, a real Shia, does our mind jump to the poets of the Ahlul Bayt. But they were some of the greatest companions. Now think about, for example, Farazdaq, whose name everybody should know because of the poetry that he had made for the Ahlul Bayt, right? And there's many other, like Di'bil, right? Another famous poet that recited wonderful poetry for the Ahlul Bayt. There's another famous one as well, whose name was Al-Kumayt ibn Ziyad al-Asadi. Al-Kumayt ibn Zayd al-Asadi. And once he was in the presence of Imam al-Baqir alayhi salatu wasalam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And in history, they say that he had recited many different types of poetry, famous poetry that we still have to this day. Hundreds and thousands upon lines that we have from him, very famous ones that scholars to this day, Orientalists, study his type of poetry. They say this is famous poetry. Other famous Shia poets of that time, like Farazdak and Di'bil, they have praised Al-Kumayt, say that he is the first and the last when it comes to poetry. He has these famous lines known as Al-Hashimiyat, and is praised for Banu Hashim, specifically the Ahlul Bayt. So once he was reciting this famous one, which is, I believe, known as Qasida al-Mimiyya. So it goes, I'm just going to recite the beginning lines. It's very deep poetry. I can't really recite it properly nor translate it properly, but he starts reciting it for the fifth Imam. And it begins, Man liqalbin mutayyamin mustahami ghayra ma sabwatin wala ahlami. And in this, again, it's a long poetry. Just these first two lines. It says, who is there for a heart that's ensnared and infatuated, that's madly in love? A heart that doesn't long for youth and doesn't long for dreams. And basically, the end of the poet is, the whole point of the poetry is that it goes through all these things that a normal heart desires. And he says that my heart only longs for the Ahlul Bayt. And it's all this poetry is about this idea of longing for the Ahlul Bayt. So he recites all of this for Imam al-Baqir. When he's finished, the Imam turns to him and says, لا تزال مؤيدا بروح القدس ما دمت تقول فينا. He says, Ya Kumayt, you will never stop being aided and assisted by Ruh al-Qudus as long as you recite and compose these lines of poetry about us. That's a lot different than saying you get Jannah or your risk increases or, more barakah to you. This is saying Ruh al-Qudus is now going to be assisting you. And for anyone who, is Ahl al-Shi'r wa Sha'ar, right, who's, into poetry, you know that a true poet, it's not something that you sit there intellectually thinking about. It's not a rational exercise. This, if it's truly done for the sake of Allah, in praise of the Ahlul Bayt, this is divine inspiration which writes these words. Now, this is what a real poet is looking for. Now, a part of me wanted to spend some time on going through the idea of what exactly poetry is. And I think it'll take a bit too much time. I'll mention a few points, and we'll see where we get to, inshallah, because I do think that it may be beneficial for us to just at least know what is some of the deeper meanings behind this word shi'r and poetry in Arabic. So let's start with that. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So in Arabic, the word for poetry is shi'r. Sheen, Ain, Ra. So from these root letters, Sheen, Ain, Ra, when you use it in the verbal form, sha'ara or sha'ara, it means when somebody intuitively understands, perceives, or subconsciously feels or senses something. So you can clearly see how you can derive the word poetry from that, right? Because you would say a poet is trying to feel something. There's a sense of emotion. And they're trying to express that and share that with the listeners, right? So we also get another derivative from this same root of sheen, ain, ra, shu'ur, which again we use in our languages as well. Shu'ur meaning emotions or subconscious. There's other words which have a loose connection, which I also want to mention because it will show us some of the deeper meanings behind what poetry really is. Another word is shi'ar. Shi'ar, right now, at least in modern Arabic, is used for a password, right? A password you use for your phone or computer or anything. It's used for slogans. It's used for symbols, for emblems, for, let's say, a mark that you would have on a shield or a flag for an army. So, okay, what's the connection between that and poetry, right? Seems strange. Now, let me take it up a notch. The word sha'ar, right? So it's the same thing as shi'r, except a fatha instead of a kasra, right? Yarhamukumullah. What does sha'ar mean? Sha'ar means hair. Hair? What does that have to do with poetry? What does that have to do with feelings? Seems strange. We'll go even worse than that, or better than that, I don't know. Shi'riya, for anybody who speaks Arab here, shi'riya means noodles and spaghetti. Like, wait, hold on a second. So we started out with intuition and feeling and emotions and poetry. Then we jump to passwords and slogans and emblems and marks. Then we go to hair and spaghetti and noodles. Like, what's the connection over here? So one of the ulama in lugha, in language, in linguistics says this, is that the deeper meaning behind this word of sheen, ayn, ra, whenever you see a word like that, the spiritual, totality in its meaning comes from this idea that anything, any word that is a derivative from this root has something to do. It has a quality of being precise, of being minute, of being thin, of being delicate, of being fragile, whenever it surrounds something else. Right? So it's this thing, when it comes from this root letter, this root word, it's talking about anything. Again, this is the sort of shared meaning behind all these words. Something minute, fragile, precise, and it surrounds something else. So now let's go back. So for example, shu'ur, which we said means emotions or something like that. Emotions are these feelings that we, express outwardly, right? Anger, happiness, sadness, whatever it is. But these are these outside sort of subtle things which is surrounding what's actually going on within our nafs, right? So there's these delicate sort of reactions that we have outside, a precise sort of reaction that we have to something that's happening internally, right? There's a state of our nafs, of our soul, and it's expressed through our emotions, and that's what people see on the outside. And of course, our emotions can be very, very delicate, but they're also very, very precise. And that's why you see in modern psychology and therapy, one of the ways for a person to really get a hold of themselves is to start precisely addressing their emotions. Not just to say, I'm sad, or I'm happy, or I'm hungry, right? It's to say, look, there's degrees of happiness. I have to understand that, right? There's degrees of hunger, right? Don't just say because you didn't eat for 5 hours, you're starving, right? Be precise with your words, for example, right? There's a difference between being sad because, you miss your kids. It's different than the sadness that you feel when you come and attend a majlis for the Ahlul Bayt, right? The sadness is not the same, although we use the same word. So there's a precision deep within us that we have to express with our emotions. So that's one thing. Shi'ar as well, right? Shi'ar meaning these emblems or these signs or these slogans. In something very small or minute. For example, if I show you a swoosh, a check mark, everybody knows, okay, that means Nike. And then you think about, the whole industry about what Nike produces. You have shoes in your mind or whatever they produce, right? All the clothing and everything else. All of that whole industry, all of these things come to your mind just from one simple symbol, right? Or for example, when you see just the flag of any alam, which might say Ya Hussein or Ya Al-Fadl Abbas or something like that. All of these emotions and ideas and feelings rush to your mind. They rush to your heart, right? So just one or two simple, precise lines can evoke all these different ideas and emotions hidden within, right? So this is the idea. So now going to this idea of, forget spaghetti, but we'll talk about at least sha'r, hair. So they say hair, the reason it's coming from the same thing is because hair is something that is very thin, it's very delicate, and it's the outermost layer of one's skin, right? Because it's the outermost layer, it's not protective in that sense, but it represents the outermost and it's surrounding the skin. So because all of these things share that same idea in mind, this is what we're talking about. When it comes to shi'r, what the job of a sha'ir then is to take a certain emotion, a certain internal feeling, a certain idea and hal of the nafs, a state within, and to try to express it in precise, delicate words. If they're successful, then they are able to, with one or two lines or words, they are able to take their state and they're able to transfer it towards you, if they're successful. And again, not everybody is a successful poet. But we see in the example of the Imam, he is able, with the precision in his words, with the poetry that he recites, which inshallah we'll go through right now, he recites and he's able to cause Muttawaki and his, the other dhalimeen there, to shed tears, to cry, to honor him, to regret their actions of drinking, to stop drinking altogether, to stop the haram action they're performing, to even cause him to give the Imam, right, 1,000 dirhams. Can you imagine if somebody had this much power in terms of, lines of poetry in order to, somebody is performing something haram in front of you, you recite a few lines of poetry and they begin stomping. Can you imagine, what kind of power that would take? I clearly can't do that. Like imagine if I'm sitting around with, some youth and let's say they're drunk or they're high or something and I say, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to stop them? Roses are red, violets are blue. I'm going to Jannah, I don't know about you. Like, well, what am I going to, it's not going to work for them, right? Maybe it'll work, I don't know. You have to have a certain power of words. If you have this understanding of how words are used, you understand the nature of people's souls, you know the exact words to use, the exact phrases to use, the exact emotions you want to evoke and invoke and cause in somebody else to get them to change their mind, to change their behavior, even if it's just for a moment. Obviously, Muttawaki didn't change his whole life. He was still a zalim. But even in that moment, the Imam, who is the wali and the Imam in Amr bil Ma'ruf, Nahi anil Munkar, is able to perform this not by yelling, not by screaming, not by condemning, but just through lines and lines of poetry. Now let me go through and share these lines that he recited. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So this translation is not my own, it's someone else's. But I'm going to read the whole thing. So this is what he says again. When, again, Muttawaki tried to get him to drink wine, of course, Imam said, we don't do that. He said, okay, recite some poetry for me. I said, okay, fine. So he begins reciting this poetry for Muttawaki. He says, the predatory and powerful rulers have turned night into day on the mountain peaks, while the strong protected them. Yet the mountains were unable to save them from death. After a period of honor and majesty, they were pulled down from their secure places and placed in their graves. What a disagreeable house and resting place. After they were entrusted to the dirt, a voice calls out, where are the bracelets, the crowns, and fine clothing? Where are those faces which were nurtured in blessings and finery, and for whom fine curtains were hung? The grave answered for them, saying, the worms are fighting each other over who gets to consume those very faces. They drank and ate in this world, but today, those very people who were the devourers of all things are food for the insects and worms of the grave. They are now to be devoured. Can you imagine Imam saying this right in front of Muttawaki? Such homes did they build to protect themselves from the vicissitudes of time. But in the end, they left those homes and families and hastened towards the abode of the grave. What wealth and savings they had stored, yet they left them all and went, leaving these riches for their enemies. Their homes and palaces were transformed into ruins, and their inheritors likewise hastened towards their own dark graves. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. I mean, even this English has some, power to it, right? Imagine, if we had some understanding of Arabic, even if I had time, I would have gone through just the Arabic lines and the way the Imam recited it, the power of the prose that's being used there. It's really like just captivating. Saying this to the face of Muttawaki, and of course Muttawaki knows exactly what he's talking about, right? It's a very clear innuendo that's here, right? And this is what causes Muttawaki and everybody else to weep, because they know it hits their hearts. They know what's going on there. You see, in the tools of somebody like the Imam, somebody with ma'rifah, this can be used as a tool for Amr bil Ma'ruf, Nahi anil Munkar. It's an ibadah. And poetry is such a powerful tool that, of course, the enemies of the Ahlul Bayt knew it well too, and they used it as well. Even people like Muttawaki. They would, as we know, they would hire people. Right? Normally we know that these zalimeen, these khulafa, they would have, paid off scholars. We know that, right? Fake scholars to go and mention fake narrations, to praise the Abbasids, to make up stories, make up fatwa. They would do this all the time, right? And even, nowadays we have this, right? In the time of the Shah, right? The previous Shah of Iran, they had these darbari mullahs, as they were called, right? People that the Shah paid off, right? And of course, we know nowadays too, governments, right? They also have paid off scholars as well too. And it's clear from the things that they talk about, the objectives that they have, the fitnas that they try to cause in our communities. And you trace the money that they're getting and things like that. Like, how do they come up, costs millions and millions of dollars, things like this. It's very clear that, these guys are being funded from somewhere, right? It wasn't just scholars they had on their payroll. These khulafa, these zalimeen also had poets on their payroll because they knew that people could be captivated. When a poet comes and they know how to mess with our emotions, A good poet can take you from Islam to kufr very, very easily, unfortunately. And I think you know where eventually we're going to lead to in this discussion. Even some of our own poets, in some of the things that they recite, even as they try to praise the Ahlul Bayt, end up taking us from Tawheed towards Shirk, unfortunately. And this is something that I do want to discuss a little bit later, inshallah. In addition to the Zalimeen and the Khulafa having the poets and some poets on their payroll, they also went around to make sure the poets who were the companions and Shia of the Ahlul Bayt would also be wiped out and killed and tormented. So one other famous poet during the time of our 10th Imam, Imam Al-Hadiyan alayhi salatu wassalam, was named Ibn Sikit. Ibn Sikit once was brought before Muttawaki. Muttawaki, he knew that he was causing trouble. So he tried to see, okay, maybe if I scare him, if I intimidate him, then maybe I can get him to change and maybe he'll be a poet on my payroll, right? Because, if you can't beat him, join him, right? That idea. So he asks him to try to force that taqiyya from him and the intimidation. He says, Muttawaki asks Ibn Sikit, this lover of Ahlul Bayt, he says, who do you love more? My 2 sons or Hasan and Hussein? Muttawaki is asking Ibn Sikit, who do you love more? My 2 sons, meaning the sons of Muttawaki, or Hasan and Hussein? And the narrators say that when Ibn Sikit heard the question itself, he became enraged. You saw the anger on his face. And what he said basically was that, he said, Wallah, I swear to Allah, he says, in my opinion, in my view, Qanbar, the slave of Ali, is greater than you and your 2 sons combined. So once that happened, then, of course, Muttawaki, killed him right then and there. And we see that amongst some of the Shia of the Ahlul Bayt, yes, they didn't make it to the battlefield. But just in them defending the haqq and the right of the Ahlul Bayt in their words, in their love, their name still lives on right now as poets who stood up for the true right of the Ahlul Bayt. Now there's a few points that I want to end with tonight about what it really means to have ma'rifah when we want to engage in this ibadah known as shi'r and sha'ir. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So we've seen, obviously, in the hand of an imam, it's just like a dua. It's a weapon of a mu'min, right? Dua. And poetry can be used as that, like that as well. In the hands of a zalim, of an enemy of the Ahlul Bayt, it can destroy people. How do you and I, or for those who are, poets and reciters, how do we all make sure, or again, those of us as listeners, how do we make sure that we are either reciting with ma'rifah or listening with ma'rifah? The first point we should keep in mind is our niyyah. And this thing is going to probably be more applicable to reciters than anybody else. It's very obvious that anything, everything, including poetry, needs to be for the sake of Allah. Fi sabilillah, qurbatan ilallah. That's obvious, that's cliche, we know that. But one thing that seems to be lacking is sometimes where we should be verbally expressing our niyyah. In terms of poetry, it doesn't actually happen. So let me share from this hadith from the 6th Imam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala. In one hadith, he's reported to have said, لا تدع كتابة بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم في الكتاب وإن كان بعده شعر. He says, do not abandon and leave starting your letters or your books or your writing with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, even if the only thing you're going to write afterwards is poetry. Now you tell me, in our communities, let's be very honest, when somebody recites Quran, obviously there's a Bismillah before they begin, right? Unless they recite Surah Tawbah. Before we recite du'as, Bismillah, right? Even before announcements are made, right? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. When somebody gives a speech or they want to mention something, a Bismillah is recited. How many times when people go and want to recite poetry, do they actually start with the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim? Now yeah, maybe they say to themselves, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt, that's great. But we know that reciting it out loud is one of the signs of a mu'min. Reciting it out loud is not just a reminder for ourselves, but it's a reminder for everybody else that, look, this poetry, this is min sha'airillah. This is for the sake of Allah. It's a sign of Allah. That's why we are reciting the praise of the Ahlul Bayt. And perhaps we should be trying to normalize something like this. I know it's not normal in our communities. In other cultures, it actually is. If you look to other cultures, they actually do recite Bismillah before they begin. Even when they're reciting their nohe. Before they start, they recite a Bismillah every single time. Whether it's with the dhun, with the melody, or without it, right? So again, I know it's very, very strange for us to hear, but doesn't that tell us something about ourselves? Imagine somebody goes to recite a line of poetry, or a noha, or a qasida, or a manqabat, and they start with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And you say, oh, that's strange, I never heard that. That weird feeling in your heart, that's what's strange. We shouldn't be, put off by hearing Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim out loud, just because it's poetry. The only reason we should be put off by hearing Bismillah is if somebody's about to do something sinful, right? If, let's say, somebody's in Vegas, right, and they're about to pull like the handle of a slot machine, they're like Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and they pull it down. Yeah, that's strange. That's something that's abnormal, right? But saying it before reciting lines in praise of the Ahlul Bayt, that's not abnormal. What's abnormal is that we haven't been doing it. So this one thing. In terms of our niyyah, we should at least try to do it verbally. That's one thing. The second is in terms of our expectations. Are we reciting and listening to the poetry just to get rewards? As the Imam said before, are we just saying, I want to listen and cry just to get Jannah? Is that it? I mean, that's good. We get Jannah. Okay, that's fine. Imam said you'll get it, get it. But is that the highest level of reward that's possible for a true Shia? Or is there a higher level possible? And this is something that I'd like to share again from our fifth Imam, Imam Al-Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam. And since we're almost out of time, I'll skip the Arabic. But the same famous poet that I mentioned, Al-Kumayt. So in another occasion, again, he was reciting these beautiful lines. Imam Al-Baqir was captivated, and he gifted Al-Kumayt with two things. He gave him a large sum of money, 1,000 gold coins, because he loved the poetry so much, right? 1,000 gold coins, and he gave him some clothes. So Kumayt responds to him. And again, I'm going to skip the Arabic, but although the Arabic that Kumayt, again, as a poet responds to is beautiful. He says, Wallah, I swear by Allah. He says, he's telling the Imam, I haven't loved you for the sake of the dunya. If I wanted the dunya, I would have gone to Ahl dunya, and I would have sought the dunya from them. The ones who have dunya in their hands, I would have gone to them and recited for them. But the reason I love you is for the akhirah, not the dunya. That's why I have love for you. Now, as for those clothes which you're gifting me, because they've touched your body, and your body has barakah, and now these clothes have barakah, this I definitely will take. But as far as this money, I can never accept this. It's impossible. I'll never take this. Can any of you imagine denying 1,000 gold coins? Impossible, right? If somebody gifted me 0.0001 Bitcoin, I'd take it no matter what it was, right? Like, excellent majlis, here's, 1/1,000,000th of Bitcoin. I'm like, yeah, alhamdulillah, thank you very much. It was all for the sake of Allah, whatever, I'll take it, right? That's a very, very tough niyyah to have. Look at how pure and mukhlis and khalis his niyyah is. He doesn't want any of that dunya to touch him. But he says, look, because these clothes are connected to you, that I'll take. So again, his love is specifically for the Ahlul Bayt. And one final point, if you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The reason the Ahlul Bayt would praise all these individuals, like Di'bil, like Farazdaq, like Al-Kumayt, and all these other poets throughout history, the reason they would come and invite them to their houses, recite praise, recite nohe and latmiyat, and all these things, have these majalis and gatherings, was because they spread the truth and haqq through their poetry. Not exaggerations, not lies. They weren't pushing the buttons of the truth. They were spreading the truth. And this is something that, again, as poets, as reciters, and as listeners, we have to be very, very careful. There's one interesting narration, and this one I actually will just recite the Arabic because it's short. One of the Ma'sumin has reported to have said, "Ash-shi'r min al-iblis." Poetry from Iblis. And the ulama have commented, said, look, not all poetry, but it's talking about perhaps the ability, the possibility that some poets, as we've seen when it's in the hands of the wrong people, can completely destroy people's iman. You and I maybe we've heard some lines of poetry before that make us, again, I've seen this myself because I'll tell you, in certain gatherings or privately, people come to me and said, I heard so-and-so in this line of poetry. Is this true about Bibi Zainab? Is this true about Imam Ali? And I have to kind of laugh it off. I'm like, what are you talking about? That's not what it is. If you want history, go to the history books. The problem is we shouldn't be saying that. The poetry that we should be hearing, look, you can talk about the fada'il. The fada'il are enough. The masa'ib and musibah of the Ahlul Bayt are enough. You don't need to exaggerate them. Now, you can put it in poetic language to, again, invoke emotions. That's fine, and that's what the poets of that time did. But that doesn't mean add masala, adding extra, adding things that go beyond. When we see, for example, that in hadith that Bibi Fatima alayha salatu wassalam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ala she said that she is Laylatul Qadr. Then in poetry, when we say that Fatima is Laylatul Qadr, and Laylatul Qadr is Fatima, that's not an exaggeration. That's there in the kalam and the alfad of the Ahlul Bayt. That's their words. But if somebody goes beyond, as we've seen, again, certain sects now start to make these connections between Allah and Imam Ali, na'udhu billah, and that starts to give us, the real Shi'as a bad name. And then people, because the poet sounds really great, and we're like, oh, subhanallah, nada hedri, all this, you get caught up in that, right? It turns into, like a coliseum, right? Our emotions go crazy. And when that happens, a little bit of those ideas start to seep in slowly. So, for the reciters, we should look ahead of time and make sure we're checking these things. Don't recite things. If you have shak or doubt, then just like we were taught by the Ahlul Bayt, leave it aside then. There's plenty of poetry that you can choose from that don't have these iffy statements. Or, again, if you're unsure, give it to somebody who's qualified. Give it to an elder. Give it to a qualified alim and say, look, is this poetry, does this make sense or not? And I've been in gatherings where ulama, after poetry has been recited, let's say a marsiya or so salam before a majlis, when the alim, because it's some of them believe it to be their duty, when they come onto the mimbar, they say, it's very beautiful what you've recited. There's videos, I'm sure many of you have seen this. Say, it's very beautiful what you've recited, but we have to make sure what you said over there about connecting Allah and Khuda and Imam Ali, no, we don't believe in that. This is the belief of Nusaydis. This is not our belief. And, of course, when the Mulana said that, he got the subhanallah, nada hedri, all that stuff. Whether it actually affected the hearts and minds of the mu'mineen, that's a different story altogether, right? But we should be making sure we're paying attention to what we're reciting and what we're listening to. We need to make sure that our goal is to follow in the footsteps of the Imam. If we know that the Imam has a deep meaning and a purpose and a maqsad and a goal, and is able to change people and get them to stop haram with his words, even in poetry, encourage wajibat, and encourage Islamic behavior with his poetry, then this should be our ideal goal as well. In our poetry, look, getting people to be emotional, yeah, that's a part of it, fine. But part of that goal should be to connect people back towards Allah, back towards the Sharia and the deen of Allah. If that is our maqsad and our goal, we are actually starting not just with the words of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, but with the niyat, the true deep niyat of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, that this is for the sake of Allah and in His path. Then inshallah we'll see that for the reciter and for the listeners, all of us, we'll see that this poetry will have a much deeper effect, inshallah. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. One more salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The Imam, after going through these various khulafa, after the time of Muttawaki, a few khalifas later, one of the sons of Muttawaki, Mu'taz, was the one who reached his limit with the behavior of the Imam. And he couldn't take it anymore. And he ordered that the Imam be poisoned. It's interesting that the Imam, just like his fada'il, the characteristics and positive traits of our 10th Imam, he carried over from his ancestors, right? His grandfathers. In the same way, we see the Imam, just like all members of the Ahlul Bayt, their musibah and masa'ib, they also inherit and carry on from their grandfathers as well. In the same way that Imam Al-Hadi was gharib and taken away from Medina and forced to Samarra, we see that our other Imams, like Imam Al-Rida, his grandfather, was also taken away and brought to another land, to Khurasan. We see in the same way that Imam Al-Hadi is given this disastrous, harsh poison. Many of his grandfathers were also given these poisons as well. In the same way that the type of poison they say that was used for Imam Al-Hadi was the type that made him, his body was under such duress and distress that he began coughing up pieces of his organs, just like Imam Hasan al-Mujtaba. But there are certain types of musibah and masa'ib that this Imam did not get that the other Imams did have. Imam al-Hadi, we would in one sense say that it must have been difficult for Imam al-Askari to be there with his father, to see him in this state, to see him coughing up parts of his body, to see him in his weakened state like this. But at that state where he's witnessing his father like this, we would say in this same place, Imam al-Rida, when he is poisoned, his son is not there with him. There is not even one Sahaba with him. When he was given the poison by Ma'mun, they say the Imam, from the effect of the poison, the 8th Imam, the effect of the poison was so much that he collapsed and fell down with nobody there to catch him. Gharib al-Ghuraba. Yes, the poison that was used for Imam al-Hadi was very harsh and he was coughing up these parts of his body. But what Imam Hasan had to do, Imam al-Hadi didn't have to do. We know Imam al-Hasan had this special bowl where he would be spitting his body parts of his liver and his blood into there. And whenever people would come, like Imam Hussein, he would say, Hussein, take this bowl and hide it somewhere because Zainab is coming here and I don't want her to see me in such pain. Imam al-Hadi didn't have to go through a difficulty like this. And where we see Imam al-Hadi, yes, it might have been difficult to some degree to have his son present, watching his son witness all of these different bala with him. We would say, what is more difficult, having your son present, watching you like this, or being Imam Hussein, Sayyid al-Shahadah on the battlefields of Karbala, all alone looking for one drop of water, with a mal'oon sitting on his chest, sitting there all alone with a dagger on his neck, with Bibi Fatima watching from far away saying, don't do this to my child, we can grant you heaven, we can give you our shafa'ah and tawassul, don't do this to our beloved. When we see that the Imam is buried, Imam al-Hadi is buried with Imam al-Askari, they're buried together. Imam Hussein's body is left there without kafan, without dafan, without ghusl, nothing is done for our beloved Imam. ألا لعنة الله على قوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون رضا بقضائه وتسليما لأمره صلوات على محمد وآل محمد.
عزیزو کیا غضب آیا نقی جگ سے اٹھا افسوس عزیزو کیا غضب آیا نقی جگ سے اٹھا افسوس شہنشاہ دو عالم وہ اٹھا جگ سے ہزار افسوس نبی مرکد میں روتے ہیں علی جنت سے آئے ہیں نبی مرکد میں روتے ہیں علی جنت سے آئے ہیں کھلے سر فاطمہ پوتے کو رونے یہاں پہ آئے ہیں عزیزو کیا غضب آیا نقی جگ سے اٹھا یوں رو رو عسکری لاشیں پیدر پہ کہتے ہیں ہر بار یوں رو رو عسکری لاشیں پیدر پہ کہتے ہیں ہر بار ہوا بن باپ کا افسوس کروں کیا میں جگر افغار عزیزو کیا غضب آیا نقی جگ سے اٹھا افسوس میرے بابا یہ کیسی نیند میں سوئے میرے تسلی اٹھ کے دیجیے عزیزو کیا غضب آیا نقی جگ سے تھا افسوس لاشے پہ زینب رو کے پکاری بھیا ہمارا کوئی نہیں لاشے پہ زینب رو کے پکاری کوئی نہیں خیمے جلے اور سجاد قیدی ساتھی ہمارا کوئی نہیں لاشے پہ زینب رو کے پکاری دیکھو اے بھائی میں زہرا کی جائی لاشے پہ آئی بے پردہ ہو کر دیکھو اے بھائی میں زہرا کی جائی لاشے پہ آئی بے پردہ ہو کر مارا گیا ہے عباس غازی قاسم دلارا کوئی نہیں لاشے پہ زینب رو کے بے کس یتیموں کا قافلہ بھائی تو ہی بتا دے کہاں لے کے جاؤں بے کس یتیموں کا قافلہ بھائی تو ہی بتا دے کہاں لے کے جاؤں لاشیں سنبھالوں یا کنبے کو دیکھوں غم کا کنارہ کوئی نہیں لاشے پہ زینب نہیں ویرا ہے خیمے خالی ہے جھولا تشنا سکینہ کے قصے کو دیکھو ویرا ہے خیمہ خالی ہے جھولا تشنا سکینہ کے قصے کو دیکھو گر کر ہوئی چر بے آس بیٹی اب تو سہارا کوئی نہیں لاشے پہ زینب کے پکاری بھیا ہمارا کوئی نہیں خیمے جلے اور سجاد قیدی ساتھی ہمارا کوئی نہیں بر محمد وآل محمد صلوات
بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم السلام علیک یا رسول اللہ السلام علیک یا امیر المؤمنین السلام علیک یا فاطمة الزہرا سیدتی نساء العالمین السلام علیک یا خدیجة الکبریٰ السلام علیک یا حسن المجتبی السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله الحسين وعلى 9 المعصومين من ذريتك علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والحجة بن الحسن عجل الله فرجه وسهل الله مخرجه وظهوره السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.